Hello and welcome to Lesson 3 of UK Landscapes. This session is going to be looking again at upland and lowland landscapes of the UK. But whereas last session we looked at the physical factors, so the naturally occurring factors that created those upland and lowland landscapes in the first place, today we're going to be focusing specifically on the human factors which have just altered them and changed those landscapes as well. So as well as there obviously being natural upland lowland landscapes because of things like geology or tectonic processes that have created like things like scarp and vale landscapes, we are now going to be looking at the three ways really, there are more than three ways, but three main ways that humans have affected the landscapes and turn them into something different. Now, to illustrate this point, you've got two images straight away on this title slide. On the left hand side, what you've got here is a landscape that's been hugely altered by agriculture, farming. And farming is one of the main ways in which we alter the landscape, because humans need food, we grow food, and this landscape, which is very much a lowland landscape, you can tell it's very flat, there's no mountains, is something which has been divided up because we are growing crops. And you can see this is mainly this is what we would call arable agriculture. So arable means growing of crops. And in Norfolk and East Anglia, and actually the southeast a lot, we use hedgerows to separate fields, and that's very distinctive when it comes to agriculture. Now, if we were looking at the same kind of agriculture maybe in an upland area, you might have other clues which tell you it's not in the southeast, and they would be things like the fields are actually separated by dry stone walls rather than hedgerows, for example. Another way we affect the landscape is through forestry, and forestry is where we intentionally plant trees for the use of woodland, sometimes for recreation as well, like think of Thetford Forest. But Thetford Forest is essentially a timber forest; it's chopped down on a rotational basis. And the final way, which I haven't got an image of, is we alter the landscape because we build stuff on it. We build housing, we settle. And so agriculture, both arable and pastoral, pastoral as animals, forestry and settlement are the three main ways or human factors that again help create distinctive upland and lowland landscapes. And you're also going to be looking at two specific contrasting areas in the UK, so you've got an example for each. Okay, to begin with though, I'm going to give you some Ordnance Survey map skills, and on 365 you will find a handout that's got a set of questions and these three maps. Okay, so it'll be a sheet like this, okay, and there's map A, B and C, which are on this screen here, A, B and C, and there's a series of questions that I'd like you to try and answer. So find that information on 365, either save it or print it out, and then when you're ready, unpause the screen, and I will go through the answers. Okay, so the answer to question 1, which map is an area of pastoral agriculture? Remember, pastoral is like farming with animals. That is map B, okay, and you can see map B up here in the top left hand side. What evidence is there for this? And again, using evidence from a map is really important. I'm hoping you spotted the words sheepfold and sheep creep in there. So sheepfold, sheep creep is useful. Also, you don't tend to graze cattle in woodlands, and the fact that there is very little woodland here, there's only a small kind of patch here on the very steep slopes, is an indicator that it's grazing land, and this little tufts of grass and marshland areas. The other thing is, the reason it's more pastoral farming area is because you can put sheep basically on hills. Sheep are good at grazing hills. They don't mind going up and down hills. Tractors don't like it quite so much, and tractors are what you use for arable or crop agriculture. So B is easily the map most likely to be pastoral agriculture. Which map is an area of forestry? Hopefully you identified that was map A, and the evidence for that is that there's lots of forest. There's only one map, and you can see it on this one. It's map A. You can see big patches of forest up here and up here. So that's the evidence that tells you it is forestry, and we'll get on to a bit more in a second. So map C is the map that is arable agriculture, okay, growing crops, and the evidence for that, it's lots of blank space, and blank space with very little contour lines, these little orange lines you can see on here, it means it's flat, and flat is good for growing crops, okay. Now, number 7, how do we know a planted forest from a natural forest? And this is very evident on the on map A you can see up here. A planted forest will Almost always, especially if it's commercial, so for logging, almost always will be conifer trees. And there's a good reason for that, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that because it's the next question. So almost always conifer trees. Conifer trees are like Christmas trees essentially. They grow very, very narrow together, and again, I'll get onto that in a second. But sometimes you might even be lucky if it says the word plantation, because that tells you it's been planted, and so that's a good clue. So the reason why we use conifer trees for growing artificial woodlands, and Thetford Forest is a really good example of this, one of the biggest like man-made forests in Europe. Conifer trees grow really quickly. And because they grow quickly, you can chop them down and replant, chop down, replant, and make more money. They also don't have branches that spread really far and wide like deciduous trees do. So think of oak woodland or beech trees, that sort of thing. They've got big crowns, big branches that spread out, which means you can't get as many in. Whereas conifer trees that kind of just basically go up and down, you can squeeze loads into a smaller space. So you make the most of the space you've got. And the other thing that conifer trees are really good at is coping with difficult conditions. They basically grow anywhere, so you can put them in very, very cold soil, frozen soil, acidic soil, thin soil, low nutrient soil, and they will still grow. Whereas bigger trees like oak and stuff like that would need a bit more regular, nutrient-rich soil to be able to grow. Number 9, what do all three maps have in common? Well, hopefully, it's not really kind of what they are like, it's what they don't have, and they don't have many houses. There's a few settlements, and actually, map A shows you a settlement called A, believe it or not. AE is the name. It's the thing is that I believe it's the shortest settlement name in the country, but there's very little in terms of housing there. They're all remote areas. What is different about the two agricultural maps? So we're talking about maps B and C. Well, the main differences between the two and why the different types of farming that go on, which answers questions 10 and 11, is that map B is very steep. It's got lots of contour lines, so it's basically hilly, whereas map A is very flat. And that again affects the different types of agriculture you can get there. I've already mentioned this really. Steep areas can be grazed by animals. Sheep don't mind a hill, but flat areas are far better for crops. Even though map C will have grazing areas, it's a patch of grazing marshland, which actually, believe it or not, is in the village I grew up in. That's very much from Norfolk. You can still graze cattle there, but it's also really prime kind of crop growing areas because the soil is really fertile and grows really rich stuff. It's full of alluvium, and it's low level, so easy for tractors to do large areas. Okay, so there you go. Lots of use of OS maps. You've got sort of contour line skills there and picking out evidence as well. Really important for exams. Okay, so now we're going to sort of add in these 3 human factors, and I'd like you to take notes for your book on these 3 different factors. So the human factors are forestry, agriculture, and settlement. Please make sure you write all of these 3 down. When you're ready, you can unpause the screen. Okay, so magically appearing, now you've got those notes, is a nice image of Norwich, which shows you all of this basically in action. You've got the settlement. Now, just how much these houses and these buildings have affected the landscape. Take away Norwich, and this would look very, very different. But also, where you've got areas that it's difficult to build on, you can see here very clearly lots of agricultural land going on. Okay, you've got a sewage works over here. Which, if you do the sort of big bridge over Norwich, the Flyview, you can sometimes smell. It's pretty grim. But near that, you've got these agricultural fields separated by these hedgerows, and again the other side of the river too. You've also got patches of forestry up here at Plumstead, and that is coniferous forest, and you've also got Mousehold Heath. Now, it's likely that this actually is coniferous forest because the soil is really, really poor. But there is also some deciduous woodland there too, and areas of this have been replanted as well. So you've got kind of all 3 going on in a very small area, just to show you just all of the different ways via agriculture, via forestry, and by settlement. We have affected massively this entire landscape. So human factors are clearly very important. This is very much focused obviously in lowland areas, and you need to have a comparison of both lowland and upland areas and be aware of the differences between the two for both agricultural purposes and settlement and forestry areas. So saved in 365, just like the OS map task was, is a task which is going to ask you to summarise two areas of the UK. One is East Anglia, okay, which I'm hoping you know where it is, and the other one is the Yorkshire Dales. Now, on your handout, you'll see, go back, there is a map, okay, and I want you to locate, just by shading is fine, East Anglia and where the Yorkshire Dales should be. Use Google, use whatever you want to do. There's a couple of images, okay, which illustrate what kind of one characteristic of each, and there is a handout that's saved onto 365, which gives you lots of detail about them. That detail is going to help you complete this, which is the landscape features table. So, for example, it'll ask you about, you read this through, okay, the first thing you do, read all of this through, okay, and it'll give you loads of detail, but it'll ask you about various things like the type of geology. And so you need to summarise East Anglia. The geology is mainly chalk, and whereas the Yorkshire Dales, it's mainly things like millstone grit, for example. Okay, it might ask you about how do the fields separate, and you can say again, East Anglia, hedgerows. In the Yorkshire Dales, it's dry stone walls. Okay, so it's just a bullet pointed summary from the information. So read through this first, and so you've got a comparison of human factors that have affected both lowland landscapes, East Anglia, and upland landscapes with a specific example. We always love a bit of exemplar material to integrate into our work. Okay, so that is fairly self-explanatory. Complete this table using this information. Bullet points are fine. So you now have a comparison, or you will have a comparison of a lowland landscape, East Anglia, and an upland landscape with regards to human features, human factors. Okay, when you've completed that, it'll take you in the region of about 10 to 15 minutes maximum really to do that. Unpause the screen and then I will finish off the session. Okay, so now you've got those two contrasting areas, East Anglia versus the Yorkshire Dales, and you've summarised those nicely. We really now have completed the very first section of this topic. Now, although it's only been 3 lessons worth, those 3 lessons have packed in quite a bit of detail. Remember, we've looked at, firstly, geology, what types of geology there are, what the characteristics are, how they're formed, where they're found in the UK. You've also looked at things like how farming affects different locations differently, and forestry as well, and settlement as well. So all of these things we've covered. We've also covered examples. We've given examples, for example, East Anglia, the Yorkshire Dales, scarp and vale agriculture, landscapes. We've looked at cross sections of geology maps. So you've covered loads and loads of detail. The good news is, remember, that this section is only worth 6 marks total. So you are not going to get an 8-mark essay on any of the stuff you've done up to this point in this topic, but you might get a tricky little question maybe worth 2 marks. That's probably the worst you're going to face. Most of this is going to be very single, very much 1-mark answers. So knowing the stuff is really important. Have that knowledge there and go over that information through your revision, please. So obviously, other physical processes, how they affect UK landscapes. We've mentioned those tectonic processes we talked about as well. That create different sort of steepnesses and different kind of contrasting landscapes. Next lesson, we're now going to start to focus and move on to the next sections of this topic. We're going to look at coasts and UK's coastal landscapes, and we're going to look at UK river landscapes. So we're going to start with coast. So lesson 4 will be about UK coastal landscapes, and each of those sections is far more complex because each one also has an 8-mark question attached to it. Okay, now through those topics, through those lessons, I'm going to give you practice on other 8-mark questions that won't appear in this topic, but it's always good to try and weave in how to practice evaluate 8-markers or assess 8-markers, even though we know that in these topics it's only ever going to be an examine 8-mark question. But more on that really when we get to it in the meantime. Just look for your notes, make sure you've got some good maybe flashcards or mind maps building up as we go, and I will see you next time for us to start coastal landscapes. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you then.